Here's 3 things that are true about today's case. A Pennsylvania Dutch folk healer who people thought had a little too much mojo for his own good, a group of 3 scared, superstitious neighbors convinced they'd been hexed, and 1 brutal murder that resulted in a wooden house that refused to burn. This is the story of the Hex Hollow Murder. 32-year-old John Rehmeyer had a problem. Actually, a lot of problems. He struggled with his mental health and had even been committed to a local hospital for treatment, which he later escaped from. His physical health wasn't much better, with some sources reporting that he might have suffered from malnutrition. His wife had left him, 2 of his 3 children had died, and he had difficulty staying employed. He was sick, poor, and stuck in an endless spiral of bad luck. And if you asked him, he'd tell you exactly who was to blame. Nelson Rehmeyer, the local powwow doctor. Nelson Rehmeyer was a tall, stocky, white-bearded, and reclusive Pennsylvania Dutch farmer. He spent most of his time in his old farmhouse in York County called Rehmeyer's Hollow. However, the locals referred to it as Hex Hollow because Nelson was well known for practicing powwow, a mix of herbal medicine and protective folk charms that had been passed down through the generations. Powwow was first brought to Pennsylvania in the 17th and 18th centuries by German-speaking immigrants. Common practices included reciting Old World incantations, reading scripture over a sick person, and the laying on of hands. Those in the community who specialized in powwow were relied on to protect livestock and crops, treat illnesses, injuries, and spiritual problems, as well as to remove curses or bad luck. To most folks, Nelson keeping these powwow traditions alive meant he was a healer. However, to a few, especially people who didn't understand powwow, he was something more sinister, a witch. John Rehmeyer would stop at nothing to rid himself of his curse. He was obsessed with the idea that he had been hexed by Nelson and convinced that the only way to turn his life around was to get a lock of Nelson's hair and burn it with Nelson's book of spells called The Long Lost Friend. John didn't plan to go alone. No. Instead, he pulled in 2 other impressionable young folks, 14-year-old John Curry, a scared kid who thought magic was real, and 18-year-old Wilbert Hess, whose parents were also going through hard times and suspected that curses might be at play. 3 dudes on a mission to break black magic and absolutely no impulse control. What could possibly go wrong? On the night of November 27th, 1928, they showed up at Nelson's farmhouse. And would you be surprised if I told you that Nelson wasn't exactly easily persuaded by this trio of terrified amateurs? No, me neither. When they entered his home and confronted him, a struggle broke out. Ultimately, it was Nelson who was outnumbered, so John and the men were able to overpower him, beat him, then strangle him until he died. Some reports say the men even tied Nelson up with rope and doused him in coal oil after they killed him. Foreshadowing. Even after all of that, though, they never did get a lock of his hair or find the book. Mission not accomplished. And because the men's superstitions reached the level of paranoia, just killing Nelson wasn't enough. The men tried to burn the house down with Nelson's body still inside, figuring fire would surely eliminate any lingering hex. But here's the kicker. The house barely burned. Only a bit of the kitchen floor ended up charred. So to the townspeople, that was all the proof they needed that Nelson's spirit was too strong to be destroyed, even in death. I mean, who needs horror movies when you've got rural Pennsylvania in the 1920s, am I right? Legend even has it that the clock in Nelson's house stopped at 12:01 a.m. on the night he was killed, which became the coroner's time of death. And since then, even though the house is still standing, the clock has never been restarted. When police got involved, the men folded like cheap lawn chairs. What's wild is that they were so afraid the hex was going to kill them that they were honest about everything they did. As soon as the public caught wind of it, Nobody could stop talking about the case. Newspapers called it witchcraft murder, and reporters swarmed the little hollow to gawk at the farmhouse that just wouldn't burn. You'd better believe the trial was a circus. Prosecutors tried to keep it grounded in the 20th century, saying things like, "Look, Your Honor, this was murder. Plain and simple." They really pointed to the fact that it was all clearly premeditated. Their argument was, even if the men believed they were cursed, that didn't justify murder. But the defense leaned hard into the men's fear of curses, trying to get sympathy for the belief that Nelson was dangerous, even supernaturally dangerous. They also claimed the witchcraft terror made them temporarily insane. And after hearing both sides of the story, the jury and the court said, nice try. John and Curry got life in prison. Hess got 10 to 20 years. But all three of the men being behind bars is not where this story ends. Over the decades, speculation about Nelson's ghost started to spread. People claimed animals wouldn't go near the house. Ghost hunters talked about cold spots and the feeling of being watched. And unlucky visitors, get this, reported misfortunes like car accidents and strange illnesses after trespassing in Hex Hollow. Modern ghost hunting groups even did EVP sessions in the house, claiming to hear faint male voices. Some even say they picked up words like leave or go. If it were me, and I heard those words, I'd be gone before you even noticed. All this strangeness really cemented the idea that Nelson is still protecting his home, even from beyond the grave. You might be wondering where the three infamous men ended up. I know I did. All of them were eventually released, and each went on to live quiet lives. John Curry, however, was the only one who made a name for himself that served as a departure from his crime. His artistic skills actually enabled him to serve as a cartographer on Eisenhower's staff in World War II. In fact, he supported the invasion of Normandy in 1944 by drafting maps for it, and he also created a shoulder patch for the D-Day assault known under the code name Operation Overlord. To this day, his paintings still hang in the homes of many York Countians. Now, I don't know how I feel about all that. Like, would I want the art from a convicted killer in my living room? But on the other hand, he really was so young when the crime was committed, not excusing it, but it's unfortunate that he was swayed at a particularly vulnerable age by a person with such conviction. The fallout was truly devastating for powwow healers. Out of embarrassment, the community turned a cold shoulder and called them quack healers and cult-like, even labeling their practices as medieval. So, the powwow healers retreated even further into the shadows, becoming more and more cautious because they didn't want to become victims of copycat killings and be hunted like witches. Even in today's world, though, powwow still exists in rural Pennsylvania, but far more discreetly than it once was. Nelson's murder also cast a spotlight on a key debate about what role cultural beliefs should play in the courtroom. In the years that have followed the ruling, courts have insisted on psychological evaluations, not just folk explanations when someone claims their actions were driven by a curse or by a spell. So what do you think? Was this a case of a murder committed under mass hysteria? Or was the claim of a hex just an excuse to rationalize a brutal killing of an innocent man? Is it possible that Nelson Rehmeyer really had power the rest of us couldn't understand? Oh, and let me not forget the fact that Nelson's house didn't burn. There is a potential logical explanation. Coal oil can be pretty hard to ignite on a damp wooden structure if there isn't enough ventilation or fuel. And it was November in Pennsylvania, after all. The farmhouse was built from thick timber, and so chances are it really wouldn't light very easily. And I can buy some of that, but the fact that Nelson's body was mostly untouched really feels like there was some kind of divine intervention. Either way, Nelson got the last word. His house still stands, his name lives on, and in Hex Hollow, if you listen closely, maybe you'll hear him laughing at those who tried to burn him away. If you liked this story, hit that subscribe button for more true tales of the strange, the haunted, and the unexplained. And for full-length episodes, check out the Monster Mashup podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. There's always more to dig up.